This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neetsahone, and today I'm continuing with my limited set review for Streets of New Capenna. Yesterday we took a look at all the multicolored cards, and today we'll take a look at all the mono white ones. Tomorrow we'll continue with blue, and so on. Keep in mind, in this video, I'm only giving my predictions for how good I think these cards will be in the limited formats. That means I'm not talking about any other ways to play Magic, just draft and sealed. That also means we're only talking about cards that appear in draft booster packs. I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on each of these cards, so if you're new to my set reviews and aren't sure what the grades mean, you'll find an explanation in the description. Also, because I haven't actually played with most of these cards, I'm definitely going to be wrong about some of them. As we start playing the format, I'll give updates on my thoughts and Needs and Notes, which is a series that comes out every Saturday. Alright, let's look at our first white card. First up, we've got Angelic Observer, which for 5 generic and a white is a 3/3 Angel Advisor at uncommon, and it costs 1 less to cast for each citizen you control. It's got flying, and it's a 3/3. So as we saw yesterday, the green-white archetype is about citizens, and more broadly, the Cabaretti are about going wide with tokens, and there are lots of citizen tokens in this set, and a lot of non-token creatures that are citizens too, as we'll see as we go through this video. That means getting this to 5 mana is pretty doable, and while that's not great, a 5 mana 3/3 flyer is passable, and sometimes you'll cast it for a lot less. 4 mana is probably going to be a pretty common occurrence. I think it's doable enough to cast this for 4 or less that I want to start it out at a B-, which means you can take it pretty early and as a first pick in some weaker packs. Next up, it's Backup Agent, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/1 human citizen at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. We've seen the green version of this card many different times, and it's always solid. It can be a 2/2 for 2 if it's alone, and the ability to put the counter somewhere else can help creatures stay relevant all game long. It has the citizen creature type, and there are some counter synergies in the set too, so this seems like a really solid bread and butter kind of common for white. It's not something you're going to be super excited about having, but it's a serviceable 2-drop. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Ballroom Brawlers, which for 3 generic and 2 white is a 3/5 human warrior at uncommon, and when it attacks, Ballroom Brawlers and up to 1 other target creature you control both gain your choice of first strike or lifelink until end of turn. This seems pretty good. I mean, a 5 mana 3/5 isn't very good, but it gets lifelink or first strike when it attacks, and it can give the keyword to another creature too, and that's definitely the kind of creature that can dramatically upgrade your board, at least on offense. A 3/5 first striker is kind of a pain to block all game long, and you're likely to have other creatures around that giving first strike or lifelink to is a big upgrade for. I think you can take this with a first pick in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Boon of Safety, which costs 1 white mana, and it's a common instant, and it says put a shield counter on target creature, scry 1. This is the first time we're seeing shield counters in this video, so I'll read the reminder text for you. It says if that creature would be dealt damage or destroyed, remove a shield counter from it instead. This seems pretty reasonable. A shield counter will allow your creature to survive a whole lot of stuff, whether it's a removal spell or damage in combat. In combat, your creature still gets to damage the thing that it's blocking or being blocked by, and if it was a trade, it turns the situation into a much better one for you. It feels like there are enough situations where you can generate some sweet tempo with this that I can definitely see running a copy of it in aggressive white decks. Feels a little bit like a white version of Tamiyo's Safekeeping. That said, it's also not that hard of a card to cut either. I think that means it's a C-. Next up, it's Broker's Initiate, which costs 1 white mana for a 0/4 cat citizen at common, and for 4 generic and a green-blue hybrid mana, it has base power and toughness 5/5 until end of turn. I don't love this. A 1 mana 0/4 isn't really what you want to be doing in limited most of the time. It can block some stuff, but that's just not enough these days. It has a minimal impact on the board up until you can pump mana into it to make it a 5/5, but it is a lot of mana. It isn't unplayable or anything, and as a late game mana sink you could do a lot worse, but I also don't really see it making the cut, even in every deck that can pay for the ability. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Buy Your Silence, which for 4 generic and a white is a common sorcery. It says exile target non-land permanent. Its controller creates a treasure token. So this can deal with any non-land permanent, but it's also a very clunky sorcery that gives your opponent back a treasure. It definitely falls short of being premium removal, but I do think the first copy is going to be something you want in most white decks since it's sort of a catch-all removal spell. Running more than one probably isn't a great idea though. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Celebrity Fencer, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/2 elf druid at common, and it has Alliance. This is the cabaret mechanic, and it gives you some sort of effect when you have a creature enter the battlefield under your control, and in this case, you get a +1/+1 counter on Celebrity Fencer. This has the potential to get really massive, but I don't love that it starts out as a 3/2. You're going to get really blown out sometimes when you play this and your opponent destroys it for 1 mana, but in a lot of white decks in this format, especially the cabaret, triggering this is going to be pretty easy, and even triggering it 2 times every now and again in a single turn is going to happen too. So this seems like a pretty good common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Citizen's Crowbar, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon artifact equipment. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 green and white citizen creature token, then attach Citizen's Crowbar to it. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has pay 1 white mana and tap, sacrifice the crowbar, destroy target artifact or enchantment, and it has an equip cost of 2. I always like equipment that makes a creature for it to equip to automatically because it makes the equipment do something immediately. Basically, this is a 2 mana 2/2 that leaves behind a reasonable piece of equipment and one that you can give up for a disenchant effect, and sometimes that's going to be worth doing. And if you do that, you also still get to keep the token, which is nice. Both of those outcomes seem fine. It's also a citizen, which matters, as we've already seen. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Dapper Shieldmate, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/2 human soldier at common, and it enters the battlefield with a shield counter on it, and as long as it's your turn, it gets +2/+0. So if you take the shield counter out of the equation here, this card would be like a D at best. A 4 mana 2/2 that's a 4/2 on your turn is just bad. However, the shield counter matters here. Your opponent is going to have to give something up in most cases to get rid of one of these counters, and sure, they could just chump it with a token or something, but they still have to put in some work, and they can't just ignore this since it can hit for 4 damage at a time. It does feel a little bit like the cards with shield counters, at least some of them, are overcosted, but I think that probably means that it ends up actually playing pretty well overall. I think this is a solid common. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Depopulate, which for 2 generic and 2 white is a rare sorcery, and it says each player who controls a multicolored creature draws a card, then destroy all creatures. A 4 mana Wrath is pretty sweet. This one does come with a significant downside though. Most of the time in this format, your opponent will get to draw a card. You probably get to draw a card too, but then they get to untap with all their mana ready and an extra card and rebuild the board before you do. There will still be plenty of situations where this can really turn things around for you in a way basically nothing else can, but I think this falls a little short of being a bomb, since letting your opponent get that card will be really annoying in some situations. It still looks really good. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Elspeth Resplendent, who for 3 generic and 2 white is a legendary planeswalker Elspeth at Mythic Rare. She starts with 5 loyalty, she has a +1, and it says choose up to 1 target creature. Put a +1/+1 counter and a counter from among flying, first strike, lifelink, or vigilance on it. She has a -3 that says look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may put a permanent card with mana value 3 or less from among them onto the battlefield with a shield counter on it. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And she has an ultimate that's a -7 that creates 5 3/3 White Angel creature tokens with flying. Unsurprisingly, this card is really good. If you already have something in play, Elspeth offers a huge upgrade with her +1, which will give you a +1/+1 counter and a keyword ability counter. That upgrade is just massive. Giving something vigilance even means you can attack and still protect Elspeth, which is awesome, and all the other keywords are nice too. And you probably will just often start with her +1. However, even on an empty board or one where she isn't well protected, she can use her -3 to find something to put on the table with a shield counter. Then, that counter really allows that creature to do a good job of protecting her so she can live another day. You do need to make sure you have a decent number of 3 or less creatures around to fully take advantage of that -3, but it's going to be pretty hard not to hit at least one creature with that ability. Note too that she can actually grab any permanent with a mana value worth 3 or less, but the shield counter won't do much on other permanents, and other permanents are also less likely to protect her effectively. Then, on top of all of that, she actually gets to her ultimate kind of quickly. You have like 2 turns to try to lower her loyalty, which is kind of hard because of her +1 ability, and then her ultimate basically ends the game. Yeah, Elspeth seems like an amazing bomb to me. I'm giving her an A+. Next up, it's Extraction Specialist, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/2 human rogue. At rare, it's got lifelink, and when it enters the battlefield, you return target creature card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. That creature can't attack or block for as long as you control Extraction Specialist. So this is a 3 mana 3/2 lifelinker with upside, and That's the kind of thing you pretty much always play. On turn 3, you won't always have something to get back, but you can trade aggressively on turn 2 and maybe get some value when you cast the Rescuer on turn 3. Obviously, the creature can't attack or block. If it could, this card would be absolutely insane at only 3 mana, but once the Rescuer goes down, and it probably will, that creature becomes whole again. It's also nice that if it has any abilities, the creature you bring back that is, those still matter when the Rescuer brings it back. So if you trigger an Enter the Battlefield ability or you get a static ability, you do get those things right away. Overall, I think that makes this card a B. Also worth noting, it triggers Alliance even though it can't attack or block right away, too. Next up, it's Gathering Throng, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/1 human citizen at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for any number of cards named Gathering Throng, reveal them, put them into your hand, and then shuffle. Cards like this are always pretty fun and limited. A 3-mana 3/1 is terrible, but as long as you have 2 of these, this becomes playable, since a 3-mana 3/1 that draws you another one is actually a decent deal. It makes sure you'll continue to have stuff to play, and getting these also guarantees you can go wide and keep triggering Alliance, and they are also citizens, so basically, if you have 1 copy of this, yeah, it's pretty much unplayable, but if you have 2, it's a C, and I think it can sort of cap out around a C+ if you have 3 or 4 of them. So, yeah, it's kind of a build around. It has to be built around itself. It's an F if you only have 1, and a C+ at best, probably. Next up, it's Giada, Font of Hope, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 legendary angel at rare. It's got flying and vigilance, and each other angel you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it for each angel you already control. And she can tap to add white mana, and you can spend that mana only to cast an angel spell. So a 2-mana 2/2 with flying and vigilance is already a B-, and she has some upside that will actually be relevant some of the time. There are a decent number of angels in this set, even at lower rarities. We've already seen 1, at least in this video, and we're going to see more and more of them in this video and throughout the week. And Giada being able to produce mana for all those angels and making them bigger is pretty nice. I think she's a B+. Next up, it's Halo Fountain, which for 2 generic and a white is a mythic rare artifact. You can pay 1 white and tap it, and untap a tapped creature you control to make a 1/1 green and white citizen creature token. You can pay 2 white and tap it, and untap 2 tapped creatures you control to draw a card. And you can pay 5 white and tap it, and untap 15 tapped creatures you control, and you win the game. You shouldn't really expect to get that third part of this going, especially because you not only have to have 15 creatures, they also all have to be tapped, and if they're all tapped, it probably means your opponent is dead anyway. That said, the first 2 abilities are very doable and offer some very nice value. It is a bit of a bummer that the Fountain is a dud on like an empty board, but as long as you have 1 creature around who can attack decently enough, you'll start making tokens on many turns. You can even attack into a trade, and once the block goes down, untap the creature and get a 1/1. Your creature still dies, of course, but you get a 1/1 that can make another 1/1 on the next turn. This all pairs quite well with the Alliance mechanic too. Drawing cards is awesome as well. So this card's interesting. I don't think it's a bomb, though I do think it kind of gets close to it. I think it's going to be harder than you might think to really get more than the token out of this, and even doing that sometimes isn't going to be super doable. This is definitely a card I could see myself being wrong about, but I already think it's really good, so I don't think I'm going to be crazy wrong, but I do think it's a B+ and not quite a bomb, though it gets pretty close. Next up, it's Hold for Ransom, which for 1 generic and a white is a common enchantment aura with Enchant Creature. The enchanted creature can't attack or block, and it has pay 7 generic mana. Hold for Ransom's controller sacrifices it and draws a card. Activate only as a sorcery. So this is a pacifism that your opponent can pay 7 mana to get rid of. We've seen removal auras in the past that let your opponent pay mana to get rid of the aura, and most of them haven't been very good. I think this one has enough going on, though, that it looks better than previous cards like that we've seen. For one thing, 7 mana is a ton, so much that your opponent may just never get there. For another, your opponent also lets you draw a card off of it, and they can only pay for it at sorcery speed. Your opponent might finally get rid of it, but they'll spend their whole turn doing it most of the time, and then it replaces itself. Now, like all aura removal, this is at a bit of a disadvantage in this format because of the presence of the casualty mechanic and other sacrifice stuff more broadly. I think in a lot of formats, this would probably be like a B- and in the lower range of premium, but I think this being an aura is enough of a downside in this format that it's just a C+. Next up, it's Illuminator Virtuoso, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/1 human rogue. At uncommon, it's got double strike, and when it becomes the target of a spell you control, it connives. This is the first time we've seen Connive in this video, so I'll read the reminder text. It says, draw a card, then discard a card. If you discarded a non-land card, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So a 2-mana 1/1 at double strike is already pretty decent, and adding Connive to the mix is pretty sweet. You always want to put counters on your double strike creatures, and this has a built-in way to do it. Now, the trigger on it isn't the easiest one in the world to get going, since your typical deck doesn't have that many ways to target its own stuff. But there are some decent tricks in white, and I can see them actually doing their thing with this particular card, and there's other ways to put counters on the Virtuoso too. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Inspiring Overseer, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/1 Angel Cleric at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life and draw a card. This is a very good common. It gives you a passable flying body while replacing itself and even gaining you 1 life. A couple of years ago, we saw a blue version of this without the life gain part, and it was one of the best commons in the set. And we've seen a non-flying version of this card in the recent past that was also quite good. That trend's going to continue here. This is another very good common that enters the battlefield and draws you a card and has decent stats, and that just tends to be a great limited card. This is probably just white's best common. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Kill Shot, which for 2 generic and a white is a common instant, and it says destroy target attacking creature. This is a reprint, and even if it wasn't, we see an effect like this all the time. This is decent removal, but it's situational enough that it's nowhere near premium. An aggressive deck isn't super interested in this because you really want cards that let you kill blockers, and this just can't do that, and that's a pretty big downside. And your opponent can also play around a card like this pretty effectively. It definitely takes an extra hit as a result of like the blitz mechanic too, which will let your opponent just put hasty creatures into play that are going to die anyway. I think this is probably just a C. Next up, it's Knockout Blow, which for 2 generic and a white is an uncommon instant. And it says this spell costs 2 less to cast if it targets a red creature, and it deals 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature, and you gain 2 life. 3 mana to do 4 to an attacker or blocker while you gain 2 life is already pretty decent, so the fact this will cost only a single mana sometimes is a big upgrade. It is still situational removal, and that's going to hurt some, but at least it can kill attackers or blockers. And it's going to be discounted pretty often in a set that is this multicolored. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Mage's Attendant, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/2 cat rogue at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 blue wizard creature token with, pay 1 generic mana and sacrifice this creature, counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 1. This is a great uncommon. A 3 mana 3/2 that makes a 1/1 body is already something that would be quite good, but adding the counter effect to the token is awesome, and the multiple bodies will be good alongside Alliance. This is one of, if not the best, white uncommon. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Mysterious Limousine, which for 3 generic and 2 white is a rare artifact vehicle, and when it enters the battlefield or attacks, exile up to 1 other target creature until the Limousine leaves the battlefield. If a creature is put into exile this way, return each other card exiled with Mysterious Limousine to the battlefield under its owner's control, and it has crew too. This is really good. It's a vehicle-based version of the enter the battlefield exile effect we see a lot in white, and in some ways, I think that actually makes it better. This is because your opponent will likely have a harder time dealing with it, since it isn't always a creature. So yeah, 5 mana to exile something and get a 4/4 vehicle with crew 2 seems like an excellent deal, and you can even switch up whatever you have exiled with it. I think this does enough to get into the lower bomb range. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Patch Up, which for 2 generic and a white is an uncommon sorcery, and it says return up to 3 target creature cards with total mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. If your deck has a significant number of creatures that cost 3 mana or less, and that seems like it's going to happen a lot in white, this seems decent. Especially if you can get multiple bodies back, since that will let you trigger your cards with Alliance and help you go wide. It is definitely a dud in the early game a lot of the time, and sometimes you just won't be able to get it going, and it doesn't feel like it's even close to a card you always play in white or anything like that, but it does seem decent. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Rabble Rousing, which for 4 generic and a white is a rare enchantment. It has Hideaway 5, and that means when it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 5 cards of your library, exile 1 face down, and put the rest on the bottom in a random order. And whenever you attack with 1 or more creatures, you create that many 1/1 green and white citizen creature tokens. Then if you control 10 or more creatures, you may play the exiled card without paying its mana cost. This looks pretty good, as it can quickly help you go crazy wide, and it will get especially spicy alongside cards with Alliance. The downside of this card is that it does stone nothing if you're behind, since you need to be attacking to generate the value, but rabble-rousing can make it so your attacks are advantageous in a whole lot of situations. It also triggers Alliance a bunch of times, which is pretty sweet. Getting the Hideaway card out of this isn't going to be super easy, but it does help you get there. This is going to feel absolutely busted if you're ahead and kind of disappointing if you're behind. I think it's a B. Next up, it's Raphines Guidance, which for 1 white mana is an enchantment aura at common with Enchant Creature. The Enchanted Creature gets +1/+1, and you can cast the Guidance from your graveyard by paying 2 generic and a white rather than paying its mana cost. Auras that can come back from the graveyard always tend to be kind of okay since your opponent has a hard time ever truly getting rid of them, and it makes you getting 2 for 1 when your opponent destroys your creature with the aura on it much less painful. I mean, it basically makes it so it's not exactly a 2 for 1, but this offers a pretty small boost, so it pales in comparison to cards like Griff's Boon, which offered evasion from the graveyard. Still, with Connive being a thing, discarding this and then being able to use it later to put on a creature is kind of decent, but I'm still not super impressed here. I think this is probably just a D+. Next up, it's Raphines Informant, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/1 human wizard at common, and when it enters the battlefield, it connives. This is a nice white common. It's either a 2-mana 2/1 that lets you throw a land away for a fresh card, or a 2-mana 3/2 that you discard a real card to, but the card you discard will often be able to give you some sort of value out of the graveyard. And both options are pretty appealing. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Refuse to Yield, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon instant, and target creature gets +2/+7 until end of turn, and you untap it. +2 power for 2 mana doesn't make for a great trick, even with a huge toughness boost. We usually get +2/+2 for a single mana, so paying twice that for the toughness boost doesn't really impress me. This is because it doesn't help you actually take down the opposing creature as much. Your creature has to have higher power on average to win the combat, if you're only getting the +2, and while the +7 matters because it can help your creature survive combat, just making your creature survive combat for a card doesn't usually feel very good. It can also help it survive damaging removal spells, which is nice, and the untap part also matters too. You can give it pseudo-vigilance when it's attacking, or ambush your opponent, though the former is usually the better way to go. As is the case with most tricks, you'd rather use them when you're attacking. So, I mean, overall, I think this is an okay trick. You know, it's not one that's unplayable, but it's also not one that's always going to make the cut. I think it's a C-. Next up, we have Revelation of Power, which for 1 generic and a white is a common instant. It says target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. If it has a counter on it, it also gains flying and lifelink until end of turn. So, this is another solid trick. The boost isn't amazing, but the counter upside will definitely come up. It can let you win combat and gain life, as well as help you get in for a bunch of damage in the air. I think it'll be relatively easy to get the counter upside with this, especially if you're in blue-white, because then you have lots of shield counters and +1/+1 counters. So you'll play this in aggressive decks that have those things going on. I think it's a C-. Next up, it's Rumorgatherer, which for 1 generic and 2 white is a 2/1 elf wizard at uncommon. It has Alliance, and in this case, you get to scry 1 when a creature enters the battlefield under your control, and if it's the second time this ability has resolved this turn, you draw a card instead. So this isn't a good stats line. A 3-mana 2/1 that costs double white is kind of rough. But scrying anytime a creature enters the battlefield is pretty good, and if you can make enough tokens or double spell with creatures, it'll end up netting you a card, and I think it'll be easy enough to draw a card off of this that it looks pretty good. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Sanctuary Warden, which for 4 generic and 2 white is a 5/5 Angel Soldier at Mythic Rare. It's got flying, it enters the battlefield with 2 shield counters on it, and when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you can remove a counter from a creature or planeswalker you control. If you do, you draw a card and create a 1/1 green and white citizen creature token. So obviously this is a bomb. It has good flying stats and 2 shield counters. That's already an impressive card because it's a huge flyer that is very hard to kill. When you play it with nothing else on the board, you can lose one of those shield counters right away to draw a card and make a 1/1. That means your opponent will have a very difficult time ever coming out ahead against this card, and if your board has other counters around and you get to attack with it, well, you just can't lose. I think this is an A+. Next up, it's Sky Crier, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/1 bird citizen at common. It's got flying and lifelink, and for 3 generic and a white, you and target opponent each draw a card. So This doesn't seem very good in limited. Sure, flying and lifelink make this a nice place to put counters, but apart from that, this card just isn't that efficient. And the draw effect also isn't great since it's symmetrical. And in some ways, it's worse than symmetrical since you're the one paying mana for the card and your opponent doesn't have to pay anything. If you time it right, you can take advantage of the card before they do, like if you use this ability at the end of their turn when they're tapped out, but the idea of giving them a card still seems pretty brutal. If this wasn't a citizen and this format didn't have decent ways to put plus and +1 counters on the crier, it would probably be like a D, but I think those things do make it come up to a C-. Next up, it's Speakeasy Bartender, which for 4 generic and a white is a 3/3 bird citizen at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life for each other creature you control. So this has passable flying stats and an enter the battlefield ability that gains you life, and those tend to be decent and limited. We see like 5 mana, 3 power flyers that gain you life a lot in limited, and they're always pretty solid. They can really help you stabilize. The downside here is that you need a board in place to gain some life, and you're not always going to, and it doesn't even gain you 1 life on its own, which is a little sad. Sometimes it'll gain you a ton of life, but in those situations where it can do that, you're probably already pretty likely to win the game anyway because you have so many creatures. Still, I think you'll gain like 3 with this often enough that it seems like a solid playable. I'm giving it a C. And our last white card is Swooping Protector, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/1 bird citizen at uncommon. It's got flash and flying, and it enters the battlefield with a shield counter on it. If we take away the shield counter here, the stats aren't very good, but like with all these shield counter creatures, they're costed this way for a reason. These shield counters are nice and provide you some pretty amazing protection. Your opponent's going to have to use up some sort of resource or mana to effectively get rid of the shield counter and then have to use something else to kill the creature. In this case, it's nice that it also has flash because you can flash it in to block and kill an X2 and kill it in exchange for just that shield counter. And of course, it can also just attack pretty well in the air too. I think it's a C+. Well, those are my thoughts on all the white cards in Streets of New Capenna. Tomorrow I'll be back to talk about all the blue cards. If you want to stay aware of when that video goes up, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the rest of this review, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.